77 American women walked into the worst prisoner of war camp in the Pacific. 3 years later, 77 walked out. Not 76, not 75. All 77 survived. And then America forgot they existed. You clicked because that sounds impossible. It was impossible. And I'm about to show you exactly how they did it. This is the story of the Angels of Bataan and Corregidor, the largest group of American women ever taken captive by an enemy. They ate worms. They fried weeds in cold cream because there was nothing else. They watched their body weight drop by 30%, and each one carried a lethal dose of morphine hidden in her hair, just in case torture became unbearable. A last resort they prayed they'd never need. They never used it. Not one of them. And by the end of this video, you'll understand why. You're going to learn 3 things that historians say shouldn't be possible. First, how 77 military nurses survived 3 years as prisoners of war when 40% of male POWs died around them. Second, why their commanding officer, a 57-year-old woman named Maud Davison, who lost half her body weight, is credited with keeping every single one alive. And third, why America gave them heroes' welcomes in 1945, then systematically erased them from history for the next 50 years. If you want to hear a story of survival that defies every statistic, tap that like button right now, because what these women endured, and what they did afterward, will change how you see heroism. Here's the statistic that makes this story impossible to believe. In the Pacific theater of World War II, the death rate for American prisoners of war held by the Japanese was approximately 40%. 4 out of every 10 prisoners died. The Bataan Death March alone killed 1 in 4 men who walked it. Starvation, disease, brutality. The numbers were horrific. Now here's the impossible part. 77 female military nurses, captured in May 1942 when Corregidor fell, held for 37 months, and in February 1945, all 77 walked out alive. That's a 100% survival rate, in conditions where 40% of male POWs died. Dr. Elizabeth Norman, a professor at New York University who spent years interviewing the survivors, said this is unprecedented. These women had no formal survival training. They weren't combat troops. They were nurses who'd been stationed in Manila, expecting to sunbathe, play tennis, and dance under the stars at the Pearl of the Orient. Instead, they became the most successful POW group in the entire Pacific War. How did they do it? That's what we're about to uncover. And the answer isn't what you think. December 1941. Manila, Philippines. 88 Army nurses and 12 Navy nurses were living what they called paradise. The Philippines was considered the best assignment in the U.S. military. These women had their pick of soldiers and sailors for dates. They swam at beaches. They played golf and tennis. Life in Manila gave them adventures they couldn't find anywhere in the United States. One nurse later recalled that duty was light and the social calendar was full. They sunbathed. They danced under stars. They felt like they'd won the assignment lottery. Then December 7th happened. Well, December 8th in the Philippines, because of the international dateline. Pearl Harbor was attacked. 9 hours later, Japanese bombers hit Clark Field in the Philippines, and everything changed in an instant. Within weeks, casualties flooded the hospitals. The Japanese invasion force, 250,000 soldiers, pushed American and Filipino forces back. Manila fell on January 2nd, 1942. 11 Navy nurses and 1 Filipino nurse were captured immediately and interned at Santo Tomas University, which the Japanese had converted into a civilian internment camp. But the Army nurses, 88 of them, escaped Manila just before it fell. They evacuated to Bataan Peninsula and the fortress island of Corregidor. They thought this was temporary, a strategic retreat until reinforcements arrived. Those reinforcements never came. On Bataan, the nurses established Hospital Number 1 and Hospital Number 2. These were the first open-air hospital wards in U.S. military history since the Civil War. Think about that. No buildings, no roofs, just patients lying in the jungle exposed to the elements, while nurses tried to treat 14,000 American troops and 73,000 Filipino soldiers. And those soldiers weren't just dealing with combat wounds. They faced malaria, dengue fever, dysentery, roundworms, skin fungi. The jungle itself was trying to kill them. Meanwhile, 250,000 Japanese soldiers surrounded them on 3 sides, and the ocean was behind them. The nurses worked without adequate supplies, without proper food, without rest, and they did it for 4 months. But Bataan couldn't hold forever. April 9th, 1942, Bataan surrendered. The nurses were ordered to evacuate to Corregidor, the fortress island in Manila Bay. They thought Corregidor would be safer. It wasn't. It was just the next circle of hell. There's something you need to know about what happened next, something that reveals the character of these women before they ever became prisoners, and it involves one nurse who refused a direct order. We'll get to that in a moment, because that decision, that moment of defiance, tells you everything about why all 77 survived. Let me take you back to that evacuation from Bataan to Corregidor, April 9, 1942. The order came down. All American nurses evacuate immediately to Corregidor. But there was a catch. Only American nurses, the Filipino nurses, the women who'd been working alongside them for 4 months, treating the same patients, enduring the same conditions, were ordered to stay behind. Second Lieutenant Josephine Nesbitt, known as Mama Josie to everyone who worked with her, refused. She looked at her commanding officer and said these exact words, "If my Filipino nurses don't go, I'm not going either." Think about what that meant. Disobeying a direct order during wartime, refusing evacuation from a peninsula about to be overrun by the enemy, risking a court-martial, risking capture, risking everything. For principle, because leaving her colleagues behind was something she couldn't do. Her superiors conceded. The Filipino nurses evacuated to Corregidor with the Americans. At least 20, possibly as many as 31 Filipino nurses made that journey. The exact number varies by source, because record-keeping during a military collapse isn't perfect. But we know they went together. And that solidarity, that refusal to abandon each other, became the foundation of what kept them alive later. Corregidor was supposed to be the fortress that couldn't fall. It's a tadpole-shaped island at the mouth of Manila Bay, heavily fortified with artillery, with bunkers, with the Malinta Tunnel complex. The tunnel was a maze of passages blasted through solid rock, and that's where the hospital was established. Underground, dark, dusty. The nurses worked in those tunnels wearing wet masks just to breathe through the dust. Every time Japanese bombs hit the island, the tunnel system shook. Dust filled the air so thick you couldn't see. The nurses treated wounded soldiers by flashlight underground while the earth shook around them. One nurse later described it as working in a tomb. The wounded kept coming, the supplies kept dwindling, and outside, the Japanese bombardment never stopped. 200 shells per hour some days. The entire island was under siege. For 27 days, Corregidor held out, but by early May, it was clear the fortress would fall. On May 3rd, a submarine, the USS Spearfish, evacuated a handful of nurses. Lieutenant Ann Bernatitis, a Navy nurse who'd been the only Navy nurse to escape Manila before it fell, was on that submarine. She was one of the lucky ones. On May 6, 1942, Corregidor surrendered to Japanese General Masaharu Homma. 66 Army nurses were captured. They became prisoners of war, the largest group of American military women ever captured by an enemy. But here's what's remarkable. Even in that moment of surrender, even knowing what might happen, the nurses maintained military discipline. Their commanding officer was Captain Maud C. Davison. She was 57 years old. She'd served in the Army Nurse Corps for 20 years. And when the Japanese took control, she immediately took command of her nurses. Davison made it clear they were still United States Army nurses. They would maintain a regular schedule of nursing duty. They would wear their khaki blouses and skirts while on duty. They would present themselves as military professionals, not as defeated prisoners. This wasn't just about appearances. It was about identity, about maintaining who they were in a situation designed to strip away their humanity. The Japanese initially kept the nurses on Corregidor, then moved them to Manila. On July 2, 1942, they were transferred to Santo Tomas internment camp. This was the same camp where the 11 Navy nurses captured in January had been held. Now, all 77 American nurses were together in one place. Santo Tomas University had been converted into a civilian internment camp. About 6,000 Allied civilians and military personnel were crammed into the campus. It was overcrowded from day one, but the Japanese allowed the internees to organize themselves, at least initially. And that's where the nurses' medical training became crucial. They established Santa Catalina Hospital within the camp. They set up wards. They organized medical care not just for themselves, but for all 6,000 people in Santo Tomas. Remember, these are prisoners of war. They're getting minimal rations. They're dealing with disease. But they're still nurses. They're still caring for patients. For the first year, conditions were difficult but survivable. The internees could receive packages from outside. They could supplement their rations with food purchased or donated by Filipino civilians and missionaries. It wasn't comfortable, but people weren't starving. But in January 1944, everything changed. Control of Santo Tomas shifted from Japanese civil authorities to the Imperial Japanese Army. The military commandant was far more brutal. Outside contact was cut off. Package deliveries stopped. Rations were reduced. This is where the impossible survival story really begins. By November 1944, each person received 960 calories per day. For context, the average adult needs about 2,000 calories just to maintain basic body function. 960 calories is starvation level. It's barely enough to keep you alive if you're lying still. And these people weren't lying still. They were working. They were caring for the sick. They were trying to survive. Then in January 1945, rations were cut again. 700 calories per person per day. 700. That's less than 3 meals at a modern fast food restaurant for an entire day, every day, for weeks. The nurses started losing weight rapidly. They developed diseases associated with malnutrition, beriberi, pellagra, scurvy. Their hair fell out. Their teeth loosened. Their bodies were consuming themselves just to stay alive. A Department of Veterans Affairs study conducted in April 2002 found that the nurses lost an average of 30% of their body weight during internment. 30%. Maud Davison, who weighed 156 pounds when she was captured, dropped to 80 pounds by liberation. That's almost 50% of her body weight gone. The nurses ate whatever they could find. Worms in the oatmeal? They ate them anyway. Protein is protein. They ate cat food when they could get it. They fried weeds in cold cream because there was no cooking oil, and they were desperate for calories. Some tried to drink blood, but water was so scarce they couldn't waste it. The conditions were beyond anything you can imagine unless you've experienced starvation yourself. And yet, through all of this, Maud Davison insisted the nurses maintain their identity, wear the uniform on duty, report for nursing shifts, care for patients, keep being nurses. Because the moment they stopped being nurses, the moment they became just prisoners, just victims, was the moment they'd start dying. There's one more thing about this period you need to know. One secret the nurses carried with them every single day. And when you hear what it is, you'll understand the level of desperation they faced. But you'll also understand their courage. Lieutenant Nash was responsible for the medical supplies, what little they had left, and among those supplies was morphine. Enough morphine to give each of the 66 Army nurses a lethal dose. She distributed it. Each nurse received a small vial of morphine, enough to kill yourself if you needed to, and each nurse hid it in her hair. They carried it every day, for 3 years, a last resort against torture, against rape, against whatever the Japanese might do if the camp situation deteriorated further. They never used it, not one of them. But knowing it was there, knowing they had that option, that final control over their own fate, gave them a psychological edge. They weren't helpless. They had a choice. Even if that choice was death on their own terms rather than whatever the enemy might inflict. Think about walking around for 3 years, knowing you're carrying the means of your own death in your hair, never knowing if today is the day you'll need it. The mental strength that required is almost incomprehensible. But here's what makes the morphine story even more powerful. Despite having that option, despite the starvation and disease and brutality, not one of those nurses took it. They chose to live. They chose to keep fighting. They chose to keep caring for patients even when they could barely care for themselves. Why? What kept them going when death was literally an arm's length away? This is the answer to how all 77 survived. Pay attention to this part. The answer, according to every survivor who was later interviewed, was Maud Davison's leadership. She kept them functioning as nurses. She gave them purpose, identity, a reason to get up every morning beyond simple survival. In Santo Tomas, the nurses worked at Santa Catalina Hospital. They treated malaria, dysentery, beriberi, tropical ulcers, malnutrition. They had almost no medical supplies, no antibiotics, no proper surgical equipment. They improvised. They used whatever they could find or make, and they saved lives. One nurse later described how they reused bandages because there weren't enough. They'd wash them, boil them if they could, and reuse them. They rationed every aspirin, every scrap of gauze, every medical tool, and they kept working even as their own bodies were failing. The physical deterioration was extreme. By late 1944, the nurses could barely stand for their shifts. Their legs swelled with beriberi. Their skin broke out in pellagra lesions. Scurvy caused their gums to bleed, but they showed up. They reported for duty. They cared for patients. There's a story about one nurse who collapsed during her shift from malnutrition. Her fellow nurses revived her, made her eat whatever scraps of food they could find, and she was back on duty the next day. Because that's what nurses did. That was their identity. And Davison had convinced them that maintaining that identity was how they'd survive. But it wasn't just identity. The nurses supported each other in ways that went beyond medical care. They shared food when anyone had a little extra. They encouraged each other when spirits fell. They celebrated birthdays with whatever tiny treats they could scrounge. They maintained human connection and compassion in a place designed to strip both away. And they did something else that was crucial to survival. They resisted becoming victims. The Japanese guards tried to dehumanize them, tried to break their spirit, but the nurses maintained military discipline. They saluted officers. They followed Davison's orders. They presented themselves as United States military personnel, not as defeated prisoners begging for mercy. This psychological resistance was just as important as the physical survival tactics. It kept their minds intact. It gave them something to hold on to when everything else was being taken away. Now, you might wonder, what about the Japanese guards? What about violence, assault, the atrocities we associate with Japanese POW camps? Here's the complicated truth. Santo Tomas was a civilian internment camp, not a military POW camp. The conditions were terrible, especially in the final year. The starvation was real. The medical neglect was real, but the large-scale atrocities that happened at camps like Cabanatuan, where male POWs were held, didn't happen at Santo Tomas on the same scale. That doesn't mean the nurses weren't at risk. They were women in a camp controlled by enemy soldiers. The fear was constant. The morphine in their hair was testament to that fear. But the Japanese commandants at Santo Tomas generally maintained a level of control that prevented mass violence against the internees. However, that changed when the Imperial Japanese Army took control in January 1944. The new commandant was brutal. Food was cut. Rules became harsher. Punishments for minor infractions became severe. And as the war turned against Japan, as American forces got closer to the Philippines, the situation grew more desperate. By late 1944, the nurses knew American forces were returning to the Philippines. They could hear bombing in the distance. They could see Japanese troop movements. Liberation was coming. The question was whether they'd live long enough to see it. The starvation was killing people, not quickly, like a bullet or a bomb. Slowly, one day at a time, bodies shutting down from malnutrition. The nurses watched internees die. They treated them, tried to keep them alive on 700 calories a day and no proper medicine, and they watched them die anyway. Maud Davison herself was barely alive. From 156 pounds down to 80, her body was consuming its own muscle tissue, but she kept showing up, kept maintaining order, kept insisting her nurses stay strong, because giving up meant dying. And she'd decided none of her nurses were going to die. On March 30th, 1942, back during the Battle of Bataan, Hospital No. 1 had taken a direct hit from Japanese bombs. 23 people were killed, 78 wounded, mostly Filipino patients and staff. The nurses had survived that. They'd survived 4 months on Bataan, 27 days on Corregidor, and now nearly 3 years as prisoners of war. They weren't going to die in the final weeks before liberation. January 1945, the nurses could hear American artillery getting closer. The Japanese guards were nervous. Some were preparing to evacuate. Others talked about what would happen if American forces stormed the camp. Would the Japanese kill the prisoners rather than let them be liberated? It had happened at other camps. The morphine in their hair suddenly felt even more necessary, just in case. But on February 3rd, 1945, the 1st Cavalry Division's flying column smashed through the gates of Santo Tomas. American soldiers poured into the camp. The nurses were free. Well, 66 Army nurses were free. The 11 Navy nurses weren't at Santo Tomas. They'd been transferred to Los Baños internment camp in May 1943. They had to wait 20 more days. On February 23, 1945, in a coordinated operation involving paratroopers, amphibious forces, and Filipino guerrillas, Los Baños was liberated. The 11 Navy nurses were finally free. 77 nurses captured in 1942. 77 nurses liberated in 1945. 100% survival rate. Unprecedented in the Pacific theater, unprecedented in modern military history for prisoners of war held in those conditions. When the nurses returned to the United States in spring 1945, they received a hero's welcome. They were icons, symbols of American courage and resilience. Women across the country were inspired to become nurses or join the war effort because of them. The U.S. Army awarded its nurses the Bronze Star for valor and the Presidential Unit Citation for extraordinary heroism. The Navy nurses received Bronze Stars as well. They were paraded, they were interviewed, they were celebrated. And then, within a few years, America forgot they existed. Here's why that happened, and it's complicated. It involves propaganda, gender bias, the nurses' own choices, and the way American society processed World War II in the decades after it ended. Let's start with propaganda, because the Angels of Bataan were used as propaganda before they were ever liberated. In 1943, while the nurses were still prisoners, Paramount Pictures released a film called So Proudly We Hail, starring Claudette Colbert, Paulette Goddard, and Veronica Lake. It was based on the memoir I Served on Bataan by Lieutenant Juanita Redmond, one of the few nurses who'd escaped before Corregidor fell. Redmond had published her memoir in 1943 specifically to remind Americans that her colleagues were still prisoners. The book's ending was a dramatic call to remember them. Paramount partnered with the U.S. War Department to turn it into a film designed to boost morale and encourage Americans to understand why we fight. The film was surprisingly accurate for wartime propaganda. Paramount worked with Redmond, with military advisors, with the War Department to get details right. When it premiered, theaters set up recruitment booths in the lobby staffed by Red Cross volunteers. The film was a recruitment tool. It received 4 Oscar nominations. Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer released Cry Havoc the same year, another film about the Bataan nurses. In 1945, they released They Were Expendable, which also featured the nurses' story. The U.S. government produced propaganda posters showing the captured nurses behind barbed wire, guarded by a Japanese soldier. The slogan, "Work to set them free." The posters were designed to motivate industrial production. Work harder, build more weapons, because American women are suffering in enemy prison camps. The Japanese used the capture of the nurses, too. They boasted about their victory in the Philippines. Look what we captured. Look how weak America is. Both sides used these women for propaganda purposes. The nurses had no control over any of it, so when they came home in 1945, their faces were already known. Their story had already been told, or at least Hollywood's version of it. They were living legends, and this is where the story takes its most bitter turn. Remember I told you America would erase them from history? Here's how it happened. But here's the first problem. The journalists who interviewed them asked trivial questions. Did you fear being raped? Were you surprised how fashion in America had changed while you were gone? The questions were insulting. They focused on sexuality and superficial concerns, not on the nurses' heroism or their medical accomplishments or their survival strategies. The nurses wanted to talk about the reality of what they'd experienced. They wanted to correct the myths and romantic portrayals in the films. But the media wasn't interested in complex reality. They wanted simple stories that fit existing narratives about women. Second problem, veterans' benefits. The nurses were denied many benefits granted to men returning from war. Why? Because they weren't considered combat forces. They were nurses, medical personnel, not soldiers. Never mind that they'd been under fire on Bataan and Corregidor. Never mind that they'd been prisoners of war. The bureaucracy classified them differently, and that meant fewer benefits. Veterans service organizations like the VFW and the American Legion didn't accept female members until 3 decades later. The nurses weren't welcome in the same spaces as male veterans. They weren't considered real veterans by the institutions that existed to serve veterans. Third problem, and this is the big one, the Distinguished Service Medal. In the early 1950s, several nurses and male Army officers nominated Major Maud Davison for the Distinguished Service Medal. This is one of the military's highest honors, recognizing extraordinary service to the United States. The Army refused. They wouldn't give any woman the Distinguished Service Medal for World War II service. Not Maud Davison, who kept 66 nurses alive through 3 years of hell. Not Laura Cobb, the Navy chief nurse. The Army's position was that the Bronze Star they'd already received was sufficient. Think about that. A 57-year-old woman loses half her body weight maintaining military discipline and keeping every single one of her nurses alive in a Japanese prison camp. 100% survival rate in conditions where 40% of male POWs died. And the Army says she doesn't deserve their highest honor because she's a woman. Davison didn't receive the Distinguished Service Medal until August 20th, 2001, 46 years after she died. It was awarded posthumously after decades of advocacy by veterans groups and historians. Laura Cobb, the Navy chief nurse, still hasn't received similar recognition as of the last records available. This gets to the heart of why the story was forgotten. In 1945, American society wasn't in the habit of viewing women as war heroes. Women could be inspirational. They could be symbols. They could be love interests in movies or images on propaganda posters. But heroes? That was reserved for men. The nurses themselves contributed to being forgotten, though not intentionally. When Dr. Elizabeth Norman began researching her book, We Band of Angels, in the 1990s, she found that many survivors had never told their stories. Some had remained in touch with each other over the decades, but others had simply tried to forget. In interviews, Norman heard the same thing repeatedly. I don't consider myself a hero. We were just doing our jobs. The nurses didn't seek recognition. They didn't take to the spotlight. They'd survived something horrific, and they wanted to move on with their lives. Some had remained in the military after the war, but even the military never asked them about their experiences. It was like they didn't exist. By the time Norman found them in the 1990s, they were in their 80s. They realized that if they didn't tell their story, no one would. Several had already died. The window for preserving their first-hand accounts was closing. Norman's book, published in 1999, brought the story back to public consciousness. It was based on interviews with 20 survivors, along with diaries and letters. It revealed details that had never been publicly known. The morphine in their hair, the exact rations, the way Davison's leadership kept them alive, the Filipino nurses who'd been erased from most accounts. But even after Norman's book, the Angels of Bataan remain largely unknown. Ask random Americans about World War II nurses, and most won't know the story. The Bataan Death March is famous. The fall of Corregidor is in history books. But the 77 women who survived it all, forgotten. Let's recap what you now know. 77 American military nurses, 66 Army and 11 Navy, were captured when Bataan and Corregidor fell in April and May 1942. They spent nearly 3 years as prisoners of war in conditions so brutal that the average prisoner lost 30% of their body weight. They survived on 700 calories per day. They ate worms, fried weeds in cold cream, and carried lethal doses of morphine hidden in their hair as a last resort against torture. Every single one of them survived. That impossible statistic you clicked for? This is how it happened. 100% survival rate in a theater where 40% of male POWs died. They survived because of Maud Davison's leadership, because they maintained their identity as nurses, because they supported each other, and because they refused to become victims, even when everything was being taken from them. They came home to heroes' welcomes in 1945, and then America systematically forgot them. They were denied the Distinguished Service Medal they deserved. They were denied equal veterans' benefits. They were excluded from veterans' organizations, and when journalists bothered to ask them questions, the questions were about fashion and fear of rape, not about heroism and survival. It took 56 years for Maud Davison to receive the Distinguished Service Medal she earned posthumously in 2001. Most of the other nurses were never recognized at the level their service deserved. You started this video in a world where you probably didn't know this story existed. Now you know the truth. 77 women, 3 years as POWs, 100% survival, then forgotten for half a century. Here's what I want you to do. Share this video, not for me, for them. These women kept each other alive when the odds said they should die. The least we can do is keep their story alive. Drop a comment with the name of any nurse from this story that resonated with you. Maud Davison, Josephine Nesbitt, Laura Cobb, Ann Bernatitis, any of the 77. Hit that subscribe button because I'm going to keep telling stories like this. Stories of extraordinary people whose heroism got buried by time and bias and bureaucratic indifference. Stories that deserve to be remembered. In my next video, I'm revealing the true story of the Manila Massacre, the single worst atrocity committed by Japanese forces in the Pacific Theater, where 100,000 Filipino civilians were killed in a month-long rampage as the war ended. It's connected to this story because some of the same American forces who liberated Santo Tomas were there for Manila's liberation, and what they found was beyond comprehension. The angels of Bataan survived their hell and came home. The people of Manila weren't so fortunate. That story next time. I'll see you in the next one. Remember them.